The phone call never came, the meeting never happened, and the most powerful woman in Europe stood in a corridor waiting for a response that Donald Trump had already decided she would never receive, not because the negotiation had broken down in the way that negotiations break down when two sides disagree about terms, because Trump had not walked into that building to negotiate. He had walked in to deliver a verdict. And the verdict had been prepared weeks in advance, sitting in a sealed folder inside the West Wing, waiting for exactly the moment when Ursula von der Leyen placed her carefully constructed proposal on the table and gave him the opportunity to throw it back at her in the most public and deliberate way possible. The document her team had spent weeks assembling was called Agenda 2026, a forward-looking name, an optimistic name, a name that assumed there was still a shared future worth planning for. There was not. What came back across that table was not a counteroffer. It was not a negotiating position. It was a ledger, a record of what America claimed Europe owed. And the number on the first page of that ledger, combined with the 3 demands attached to a 30-day deadline, has just set in motion a chain of events whose consequences are already spreading through European bond markets, European coalition governments, and European defense ministries faster than any emergency summit can contain them. The post-war order is not dying slowly, it is being dismantled at speed, and Europe is only now beginning to understand that the shelter it has been standing under for 70 years was never unconditional. The back-channel conversations that took place in the final hours before the official rejection were the conversations that set the tone for everything that followed. The people inside those rooms have been placed under strict confidentiality arrangements that have so far held. What has leaked through the multiple channels that serious diplomatic information always eventually finds has been sufficient to establish the essential character of what occurred even without the full detail that the confidentiality orders are designed to protect. Von der Leyen did not walk into Washington unprepared. Her team had spent weeks constructing what they internally called a renewed partnership framework, a document designed to reset the relationship between Brussels and Washington on terms that acknowledge the changed political reality of Trump's second term while preserving enough of the existing transatlantic architecture to provide a foundation for the kind of incremental rebuilding that European diplomatic strategy had always depended upon. The document was titled Agenda 2026, and the title had been chosen with the same care that goes into every element of high-stakes diplomatic communication: forward-looking, optimistic, projecting the assumption of shared interest in a future that both sides had reasons to construct together. The proposal rested on 2 central commitments that von der Leyen's team believed addressed the core of what the Trump administration had been demanding publicly and through back channels for months. First, a freeze on existing tariff levels that would halt further escalation of the trade conflict while creating space for a more comprehensive renegotiation. Second, a continued joint commitment to financial support for Ukraine, structured in ways that distributed the burden more equitably between American and European contributions and addressed the domestic political constraints that made continued American participation in that support increasingly difficult for the administration to defend to its own base. Both pillars had been constructed through months of internal European negotiation that had required significant political capital from von der Leyen's office to assemble. Maintaining European unity around a common position on tariffs had required managing the competing national interests of 27 member states whose economic exposures to American trade policy varied enormously and whose governments faced different domestic political pressures in responding to it. Constructing a Ukraine funding framework that could credibly claim to reduce American financial burden while maintaining the military support that Ukraine needed to continue functioning had required creative financial architecture that several member states had resisted for reasons that had taken months of diplomatic work to address. The proposal represented the maximum that European institutional politics could produce under the constraints that existed. It was the best offer that the process of building consensus across 27 governments with 27 different sets of interests and 27 different domestic political contexts was capable of generating. Trump's team reviewed it and sent back the ledger. The word ledger had been chosen with the same deliberateness that von der Leyen's team had applied to the word agenda. A ledger is not a negotiating document. It does not invite discussion or propose compromise or suggest that the party presenting it is interested in finding a mutually acceptable middle ground. A ledger is a record of accounts. It presents numbers as facts rather than positions. It implies that what follows from those numbers is not a matter for negotiation, but a matter for settlement. The figures inside the ledger addressed the trade dimension first, and the trade dimension alone was sufficient to make clear that what was happening was not a continuation of the diplomatic process that Agenda 2026 had been designed to sustain. The United States had absorbed a trade deficit with the Eurozone of $350 billion in a single fiscal year. That number was not presented as one data point in a complex economic relationship requiring nuanced analysis. It was presented as evidence of systematic extraction, of an arrangement in which American consumers and American markets had been funding European prosperity while European trade policy had been structured to prevent the reciprocal flow that a genuine partnership would have produced. The message that accompanied the ledger was not delivered in diplomatic language. It was delivered in the register of a creditor who has decided that patience has reached its limit. The era of the American piggy bank is over. Those words, delivered slowly and with the specific quality of certainty that distinguishes a final position from an opening one, were the words that told every person in that room that the meeting had not been called to explore the possibility of agreement. It had been called to communicate the end of an era, and to ensure that the communication was received with sufficient clarity that no subsequent diplomatic maneuver could be conducted under the misapprehension that a different outcome was available through persistence or creativity. The trade deficit was only the opening argument. The ledger went deeper into the specific vulnerabilities of the European economic architecture in ways that made clear the preparation behind it had been thorough and deliberate. The German automobile sector appeared at the top of the itemized list of European industries that the ledger identified as having benefited from an asymmetric trade relationship at American expense. This was not accidental placement. It was a signal about what the consequences of noncompliance would target first and most severely. Article 24 of von der Leyen's Agenda 2026 proposal had included a specific protection for German automotive manufacturers against a proposed 25% tariff. That exemption had been one of the most politically sensitive elements of the European proposal to assemble because it reflected the enormous domestic German political pressure that the automotive sector's exposure to American tariff policy had generated, and because it created internal European tensions with member states whose industries did not receive equivalent protection. The exemption that had been designed to protect Volkswagen and BMW became in Trump's framing the smoking gun that proved the pattern the ledger was documenting. Europe had been structuring its trade proposals specifically to shield its most economically significant industries while characterizing the resulting arrangements as mutual benefit agreements. The exposure of that pattern in the most public possible setting, in a room full of people who understood immediately that the framing would travel beyond the room, was the specific humiliation that the rejection of Article 24 had been designed to deliver alongside its practical trade consequences. The financial markets absorbed what had happened before the official communications about the meeting had been drafted. The DAX index in Frankfurt fell 4.5% in a single afternoon session. Volkswagen's market capitalization contracted by billions before the closing bell. BMW followed the same trajectory. The supplier networks and logistics companies whose operational viability depended on the health of the German automotive sector transmitted the shock further into the German industrial economy in the hours that followed as the probability that the American tariff threat would be executed moved from theoretical to imminent in every serious risk assessment being conducted across the financial system. The security dimension of what had been communicated in the meeting began to register in European defense ministries before the trade consequences had finished reverberating through the financial system. The freeze on high-level contact between Washington and Brussels had been explicitly linked by Trump's team to what they described as a systematic burden-sharing failure that had persisted across 7 decades of the alliance. The United States was spending approximately 3.5% of GDP on defense. Spain was spending 1.5%. Italy was barely above 1.5%. Germany, the economic engine of the European continent, had spent years making commitments to reach the NATO 2% target and had consistently failed to honor those commitments. The accounting was ending. The security guarantee whose unconditional continuation European defense planning had assumed was now conditional in ways that every government along the alliance's eastern flank was being forced to recalculate its strategic position around in real time. Section 2. The panic that spread through the Berlaymont building in Brussels in the hours following the collapse of the Washington talks was not the controlled professional crisis management that the leadership of a 27-nation bloc is supposed to deploy when the external environment shifts in ways that require institutional adaptation. It was the specific quality of institutional disorder that only arrives when the foundational assumptions underpinning an organization's entire operating model are invalidated simultaneously, and the people responsible for responding discover that no contingency planning exists for the scenario they are actually facing, because the scenario was one that the planning process had always treated as too unlikely to warrant serious preparation. Emergency calls between European leaders were described by intelligence observers monitoring the communications as chaotic and accusatory in ways that reflected not just the severity of the immediate crisis, but the accumulated tensions of years of managed disagreement about European strategic direction that the Washington rejection had suddenly made impossible to continue managing through the normal mechanisms of diplomatic courtesy and institutional process. Macron and the German Chancellor were reportedly conducting conversations through encrypted lines whose content bore no resemblance to the careful public messaging that both governments were simultaneously constructing for their domestic audiences. The gap between what European leaders were saying to each other in private and what they were saying to their publics in the hours after the talks collapsed was itself a measure of how completely the situation had moved beyond the frameworks within which European political communication normally operates. Macron was pushing for an immediate European army initiative, a rapid deployment force that would signal to Washington and to the watching world that Europe possessed the collective will and the institutional capacity to provide for its own security independent of American military power. The proposal was not new. Versions of it had circulated through European defense policy discussions for years, always generating the same cycle of initial enthusiasm, substantive objection, and eventual indefinite deferral that characterized European institutional responses to proposals whose political appeal was inversely proportional to their operational feasibility. Military experts who were consulted in the immediate aftermath of the Washington breakdown were unanimous in their assessment of what a European rapid deployment force would actually represent in the strategic environment that Trump's ultimatum had created. Without American logistics infrastructure, without American intelligence sharing arrangements, without American satellite networks providing the real-time operational picture that modern military effectiveness requires, a European army was not a fighting force capable of deterring the threats that the withdrawal of American security guarantees would expose the continent to. It was a symbol, and the specific problem with symbols as security guarantees is that the adversaries they are meant to deter are capable of distinguishing between a symbol and a capability with a precision that makes the distinction strategically decisive. The dossier was the dimension of the situation that von der Leyen's public statement had been most carefully constructed to avoid acknowledging. Trump's team had reportedly assembled a documented account of a specific category of financial flows that, if the account was accurate and if it was released in the manner that its existence as a pressure instrument implied it might be, would not merely complicate von der Leyen's political position, it would detonate a scandal whose blast radius extended far beyond her personal career into the foundational legitimacy of European institutional governance. The allegation was direct. European Union funds had been channeled to specific non-governmental organizations that had conducted active campaigns against Trump during the American election. The implications of that allegation, if the documentary evidence behind it was as solid as Trump's team was representing it to be, moved the situation from the category of political disagreement between governments with different interests into a categorically different territory. A foreign government using public funds to interfere in an American election was not a trade dispute. It was not a burden-sharing argument. It was a justification for the kind of response that American administrations have historically reserved for adversaries rather than allies. The question that nobody in the European press had yet been willing to print in its full form was the question that von der Leyen's single carefully worded public statement had been designed to prevent from becoming the organizing frame through which the entire Washington breakdown was understood. Was the trade rejection about the $350 billion deficit? Was the security ultimatum about NATO funding gaps? Or had both of those things always been the stage dressing for the delivery of a single personal message to a single individual about something that had nothing to do with tariffs or defense budgets and everything to do with a documented financial trail that Trump had been holding in reserve for exactly the moment when its deployment would cause maximum damage? The 30-day ultimatum had not been drafted in response to the failure of the Washington talks. It had been sitting in a sealed folder inside the West Wing before von der Leyen's plane landed in Washington. It had been prepared weeks in advance with the specific foreknowledge that the talks would fail because the talks had not been designed to succeed. They had been designed to provide the public occasion for the delivery of the ultimatum under circumstances that made European defiance of it look like the cause of the crisis rather than the response to a pressure campaign that had been in preparation for months. The three demands inside the ultimatum had been constructed with the ruthless understanding of European institutional vulnerabilities that comes from years of systematic analysis of exactly where the continent's political and economic architecture was most exposed to external pressure. The first demand was the most immediately destabilizing in its domestic political consequences for every European government that would be required to explain it to its own population. Europe must pay retroactive defense dues estimated at $80 billion, not future commitments structured as increased NATO spending spread across a decade of gradual budget adjustments that could be absorbed without triggering the kind of immediate political reaction that coalition governments in fragile parliamentary situations could not survive. Retroactive payment, money claimed to be owed for years of systematic underfunding of NATO obligations, while American taxpayers absorbed the cost of the security guarantee that European defense budgets had been structured around the assumption of receiving without paying its full price. The political problem that demand created for European governments was not primarily financial. $80 billion distributed across the European economy was painful but manageable in ways that creative fiscal architecture could address without producing immediate economic crisis. The political problem was the conversation the demand required European leaders to have with their domestic populations, explaining why their country owed Washington decades of back payments for security that their citizens had always understood to be part of a mutual alliance, rather than a service being provided on credit terms that had never been disclosed, was not a conversation that any European leader facing an election year wanted to conduct, and 2026 was very much an election year across multiple major European economies simultaneously. The second demand targeted the institutional fabric of European regulatory sovereignty in ways that went beyond the specific financial impact of the taxes being demanded and into the question of whether European governments retained the right to make independent regulatory decisions about the digital economy that their citizens lived and worked in. The digital services taxes that France, Italy, Spain, and Austria had introduced in recent years, collectively extracting billions from American technology companies whose European operations generated revenues that the pre-digital tax architecture had not been designed to capture, were to be dismantled immediately and without negotiation. From Washington's perspective, the framing was straightforward. These taxes were not legitimate revenue measures applied even-handedly to all digital commerce regardless of origin. They were discriminatory instruments designed to handicap American technological companies whose market positions in Europe represented an extension of American economic power that European governments had decided to constrain through regulatory mechanisms that they lacked the political will to defend as the trade barriers they actually were. The timeline attached to the demand was not measured in the months that a negotiated phase-out of complex tax arrangements would normally require. It was measured in days. The third demand was the one that transformed the ultimatum from an economic document into something that looked like a restructuring of the fundamental terms on which the transatlantic relationship operated. Europe must accept new American tariffs on luxury goods and automobiles without retaliation of any kind. No counter tariffs. No complaints filed through World Trade Organization processes, no coordinated European response assembled through the institutional mechanisms that the EU had developed precisely for the purpose of responding to trade measures that violated the rules-based framework governing international commerce. Simply absorb the impact and operate under the new terms as facts that the changed nature of the relationship required accepting. The specific engineering of that demand was the part that European trade ministers were spending the most time analyzing in the emergency consultations that followed the ultimatum's delivery. The demand was not primarily about the economic impact of the tariffs themselves, severe as that impact would be across the luxury goods and automotive industries that France and Germany in particular depended on for export revenues and for the employment and tax base those exports supported. It was about what accepting the demand without re-architecture of that provision gave the American president sweeping unilateral authority to impose tariffs, restrict imports, and effectively close the American market to foreign goods without requiring congressional approval or submitting to international arbitration processes whose outcomes could be appealed and delayed through the procedural mechanisms